So, with seemingly every other movie, TV show, and especially video game these days trying to convince us we live in some sort of zombie apocalypse with an army of the undead roaming the lands. Let's go this way. So, in order to showcase that this is absolutely not a new phenomenon, allow me to invite you into the dark, comedic, medieval clown car that was the Fourth Crusade. Of course, at the time, nobody called it that. Contemporaries usually referred to a crusade as a pilgrimage, or an expedition, or a passage, or, conversely, as an invasion if you happen to be on the receiving end. Nor were these things being numbered at the time, except, apparently, by Pope Urban II, who called the very first crusade in 1095, and whom we see here counting in the passages. On top of that, those church-endorsed missions weren't necessarily targeting the Holy Land. Among others, the Spanish Reconquista that ended in 1492 was a crusade in all but name. We'll get back to that. Nor were the people on the receiving end of a crusade necessarily Muslims, or, for that matter, non-Christians. And you'd better believe we'll get back to that as well. So, after the spectacular and unexpected success of the First Crusade, that saw the holy warriors not only take Jerusalem against all odds, but also set up literal crusader states all over the Levant that in some cases lasted for centuries. After that had happened, every crusade that followed tried to mimic that outrageous and certainly divinely facilitated achievement. What pretty much everybody failed to see, however, was that the First Crusade also marked the last time Muslim leadership would be found asleep at the wheel. Meaning, when the powerful Pope Innocent III called for another crusade to Jerusalem in 1198, there was no reason to believe the fourth time wouldn't also be the charm, especially seeing as the idea picked up steam after the untimely death of Richard the Lionheart, one of the leaders of the Third Crusade. His nephew, the French Count Thibaut of Champagne, hosted a nightly tournament to mourn Richard's passing, and at that event he publicly, and consequentially, took the cross, joining the Fourth Crusade, along with other nobles, one of which was Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester. More about him later. What the chroniclers will tell you is that subsequently, in early 1200, Thibaut et al. Met near Paris to work out the logistics of the crusade. What we know by now is that just meant that someone was getting behind the wheel of the clown car. To wit, the first thing they did was pick up on an idea that the Lionheart had previously considered, but, smartly enough, not implemented. That idea was based on the notion that any Crusader state in the Holy Land needed a strong nearby base for constant military and economic support. And the base in question was the Sultanate of Egypt, meaning Egypt would have to be taken first, and Richard had wisely hit the pause button after taking a look at the liquid elephant in the room. His fanboys weren't so wise. They decided right off the bat that the Fourth Crusade would be solely maritime in nature, with everyone and everything, knights, soldiers, squires, sailors, horses, weapons, armor, siege engines, provisions, and so on, being shipped over the choppy-ass Mediterranean to Egypt and onto the Holy Land. And, of course, because they were also pretty sure that to everyone else this idea would sound about as crazy as it was. The second thing they decided on was to simply not tell anybody. So the preachers they sent out all over Europe to recruit soldiers did mention the end goal of Jerusalem, but not the stops along the way, let alone the nature of the way. And with mass deception obviously being a wholesome start to any endeavor, Crusade leadership set out to find some actual ships, or at least someone who could build them. Now, the ones they eventually wound up with, at least in Catholic apologia, are usually made out to be the true villains of this sad and pathetic story. And just FYI, as a lifelong agnostic, I don't have a metaphysical dog in this race. not even a puppy. So, here's the place of the second act, the Republic of Venice, an obviously seafaring polity that would eventually wind up existing for 1150 years. Presumably because it was also referred to as the most serene Republic of Venice. I love that. Now, with serenity being the logical opposite of a crusade, the negotiations took weeks because for the Venetians, this proposal, at least temporarily, would mean the end of their republic as they knew it. For a whole year, the roughly 100,000 inhabitants would have to drop everything they were doing and solely focus on building and manning the Crusader fleet. A fleet that, according to the people at the helm of the crusade, would have to transport between 30 and 40,000 troops, because that's how many people they expected to show up in Venice. Now, having been around the block a few times, the serene Venetians seem to remember that the largest maritime expedition they had ever seen take place on the Mediterranean hadn't even reached half that size, and most of them had been much smaller. So when they eventually agreed to the deal, they made sure to stipulate for their money to be paid up front. All 85,000 silver marks of it, which is obviously hard to modernize, but in today's money that would be at least $25 million, and especially in the context of the time, that was a humongous sum of cash. A kingdom like Spain or England or France was looking at about half of that in annual revenues. But keep in mind that the Venetians had to build every single vessel from scratch, from transport ships to war galleys that could house fully armed knights on horseback, ready to storm the beaches. And they had to do that about 400 times, while their whole republic was fully committed to this one task. Speaking of which, this is the Doge, basically the Prime Minister of Venice at the time, Enrico Dandolo, who was almost 100 years old, blind, and still took part in the expedition. Talk about commitment. Now, about that cash up front part, what the Venetians didn't know was that the brilliant Crusader plan also included contributions from the rank and file troops to help cover their fares. The very rank and file that had never been told about the plan in the first place, many of whom had, consequently, already left for the Holy Land. And even if they did it on a boat, it had been from other ports like Marseille or Genoa, with the end result being that only about a third of the projected numbers showed up in Venice, and with them, about a third of the money. So the not quite so serene anymore Venetians let their genius business partners know that without the agreed-to sum being produced, not only was there no leaving for Egypt, there was no leaving, period. But even with all of the participants having to reach deep into their pockets, often to the point of bankruptcy, and, embarrassingly, after taking out a loan from a Venetian bank of all places, the Crusaders fell way short. And while their leaders could vividly imagine coming home as complete and utter failures, the Venetians wasted no time going from ship to salesmanship, because Venice was obviously not the only denizen of the Adriatic, and one particularly pesky and rambunctious rival was the city of Zara in modern-day Croatia. So the nonagenarian Doge came up with let's call it a business proposal. To make up for at least part of the missing money, the Crusaders could help the Venetians take care of the problem, if you know what I'm saying, gentlemen. Well, they did. And not only did they agree to the proposal, they were also on the same page when it came to another point. Months earlier, when Pope Innocent had been presented with the specifics of the planned operation, he fully understood the temptation on the part of the business-savvy Venetians to use the Crusader army for ulterior motives. Consequently, on pain of excommunication, he had issued a stern warning to the people at the helm that under no circumstances were there to be any attacks on fellow Christians. Obviously, that especially went for cities that were under explicit papal protection. And as you can probably guess by now, the city of Zara checked both boxes, which is why the Pope's letter was swiftly designated "burn after reading." meaning when on October 1st, 1202, the Crusader army finally left Venice, most of them thought they were en route to Jerusalem and were blissfully unaware that they were about to change history in a very different way and never make it to Egypt, or the Holy Land for that matter, and turn the schism between the Western and Eastern churches into a perennial rift. Oh, and wind up not being Christians anymore themselves. But here we are, on the beautiful beaches of Zara, where, at least for a brief moment, everyone was on the same page. The Venetians wanted to get rid of a rival city, and Crusader leadership had to pay the Venetians. As for the foot soldiers, not only were many of them flat broke and had been told that sacking places along the way was a financial necessity, they also didn't know about the Pope's warning. And so, on November 24th, 1202, Zara, a city older than Rome, was raided and plundered. Specifics are hard to come by because many chroniclers aren't exactly keen on documenting this debacle. The only thing everybody seems to agree on is that about 100 of the invaders died, fighting each other over the booty. Classy. No honor among thieves, not even the holy ones. Including the aforementioned Simon de Montfort, actually, who was so outraged by all of this that he quit the crusade and took off. Still more about him later. But by all means, the pivot point that turned the Fourth Crusade from a sad and pathetic failure into a historic disaster of epic and highly consequential proportions, that pivot point was still to come, in the form of this man, Boniface of Montferrat, who had briefly left the crusade to visit family up in Swabia, where he was introduced to this kid, 19-year-old Alexios Angelos, who told him the sob story of the millennium. His father, he said, had been deposed as the rightful emperor of a distant realm, and if the Crusaders could help install his family back on the throne, something the people of his homeland desperately wanted, he would offer them, brace for impact, to pay all the outstanding debt to the Venetians, an additional 200,000 silver marks, full provisions for the whole crusade, an additional 10,000 soldiers, 500 knights to permanently defend the Holy Land, and submission of his local church to Rome. And just in case you're wondering, every single one of these line items was ludicrous on its face, especially the last one, because the distant realm that punk kid was from was the city and empire of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Church, among other things. To even insinuate that the people, let alone the clergy, were going to submit to the Pope was somehow even more preposterous than the other promises. Constantinople at this point was still a power player in the region, but it was far removed from former glory, militarily or economically. Yet, and partly because the Venetians vehemently supported the proposal, the leaders of the crusade went along, and again establishing themselves as masters of human resources, they agreed that this was one of an additional 2 things they would keep on the DL. What was the other thing, you ask? Well, that would be Pope Innocent's ineluctable reaction to the Zara incident, a reaction that basically amounted to a holy hissy fit. He had explicitly warned against harming Christians, and when the Crusaders did it anyway, he did what he said he was going to do. Still, unbelievably, he excommunicated the Crusaders. The very people who were supposed to bring Christianity to the Holy Land were excluded from church services, ostracized socially, and threatened with spiritual damnation. Religiously speaking, the Fourth Crusade was an army of the undead. And keep in mind the heft the cudgel of excommunication carried certainly came from the things I just mentioned, but it also hinged on the person wielding said cudgel. If we put up, say, the aforementioned Urban II for comparison, he was technically not the Pope when he called the First Crusade. He was a Pope, as in one of them. That's right, there was a rival Pope, Clement III, And the mere fact that Urban felt the need to call the First Crusade from France rather than Rome, where he had been attacked by Clement's associates, that fact alone tells you a lot about the difference to Innocent III, who, even at the time, was considered one of the most powerful men in Europe, in both ecclesial and secular terms. So when he excommunicated someone, that was going to have an impact. That is, of course, provided that someone knew about it. But, like I said, the Pope's excommunication never made it to the foot soldiers of the Crusade. They were a zombie army without knowing it. Or, for that matter, without knowing that they're headed for Constantinople right now, where we will catch up with them. Meanwhile, let's go over here, because I know some of you, especially the history buffs, might be wondering, if the participants of the Fourth Crusade were excommunicated by the Pope for attacking Christians in 1202, why did it take less than 3 decades for another Pope, Gregory IX, to issue a papal bull in 1231 establishing the Inquisition? Something that very much included the persecuting, trialing, and otherwise harming Christians by other Christians. And as you may know, that only got worse as time went on. What happened in that very narrow time frame? Well, unlike what you might expect, and certainly unlike what I expected, we are not looking at a scenario where 30 years of theological discourse led to the inception of the Inquisition, with all the practical ramifications that followed. Actually, it was the other way around. That papal bull of 1231 was the theological justification of things that had already happened in the preceding decades. And you will never guess who made them happen. Remember when I said earlier that crusades were not necessarily targeting non-Christians? Well, the Fourth Crusade would certainly be a case in point, but whatever you think about that, given the explicit goal of going to Jerusalem, what happened on the way there were side effects of achieving that end. Homicidal side effects driven by greed and based on incompetence to be sure, but still derivative to the overarching goal. What happened in France between 1209 and 1229, however, was not like that. The so-called Albigensian Crusade was directly targeted at a Christian sect called the Cathars, whose theological leanings the Pope didn't like, and who, for that reason, were considered heretics. Consistent estimates put the number of Christians killed during that crusade at about 1 million, with huge swaths of land being depopulated. And like I said, you'll never guess who initiated that mass murderous crusade against Christians. That's right, our old acquaintance, Innocent III, who was still the Pope in 1209. And when it came to finding someone to do the wet work, again, not in your wildest dreams will you imagine who signed up. Here he is, the honorable and righteous Simon de Montfort. The very guy who had rage quit the Fourth Crusade because he was outraged, he'll let you know, about attacking Christians, now teamed up with the Pope who had excommunicated said crusade for exactly that. In order to lead a crusade against Christians that saw uncounted numbers of them slaughtered, with Simon here often named as one of the most brutal assailants. Obviously, you didn't need to be a logician to detect the obvious inconsistency here. Not to mention the blatant hypocrisy. And so, 2 years after the crusade ended in 1229, another pope came up with an ex post facto justification. Based on the concept of anathema, which is still in secular use today, he established the Inquisition, which gave church legitimacy and religious veneer to what had been happening for decades anyway. And because we still have a little time left here, seeing as our heroes are just crossing into the Sea of Marmara, this might be as good a moment as any to point out some astounding parallels between those developments in Christianity and the faith of the people the Fourth Crusade set out to attack, Islam. Because one of the better documented aspects of the First Crusade is the fact that at least part of Urban's rationale behind sending armed knights to the Holy Land, as in far away, was the fact that these armed knights, while they were at home, tended to fight each other. A lot. And pretty much everyone else. And the enormous bloodshed was barely curbed by the fact that the church explicitly forbade fighting on specific days, like Sundays or holidays. and against specific groups like women, children, and, of course, the clergy. Meaning calling for a crusade and sending these menaces to society to a place many months away to fight, other people was at least part of the idea. In a similar vein, you could argue that the Spanish crown was in a comparable position after having fought the Reconquista for almost 800 years. The so-called Hidalgo class, minor nobles who had spent their entire lives fighting, had to be taken care of somehow after the Muslims had been driven out in 1492. And the reason we know about people like Hernán Cortés or Francisco Pizarro is that the crown didn't put them on horseback, but on ships. I am confident that encountering those testosterone-driven thugs had no negative impact on the people on the ground when those ships eventually made landfall. As for the Muslims themselves, at the chronological and spatial origin point of their faith, we find a surprisingly similar scenario. The Arabian tribes Muhammad united at the beginning of the 7th century had been fighting each other for ages, and keeping that in check was only possible with the authority of the Prophet, who decreed that Muslims don't fight each other. However, when Muhammad died in 632, one aspect became both obvious and significant. You see, the overwhelming importance of Muhammad in Islam doesn't just stem from the fact that he was a prophet. Abraham, Ismail, or Jesus for that matter are regarded as prophets as well. What sets Muhammad apart is the fact that he was the last prophet. And what that meant in 632 is that whoever fulfilled his role in leading the community of Muslims, the Ummah, didn't do it as a prophet, but merely as a representative of the Prophet, a caliph. And when it became obvious that that position simply lacked the authority to hold the internecine fighting in check, well, just like Christian leadership would do later, the caliphs, again, at least as part of their rationale, decided to export the problem, which is how the Muslims ended up in Spain, or Jerusalem for that matter, in the first place. And as for the Prophet's stipulation of not harming other Muslims, that could be upheld on a broad scale as long as Islam was expanding to new places. But later on, especially with the partition of the Ummah into different segments like Sunnah and Shia, let's just say a theological veneer was needed to get over that hump. And here it was in the form of takfir, the act of declaring other Muslims apostates or heretics, just like in Christianity later on. And when, also later on, weaponry became much more effective and indiscriminate, one Muslim scholar eagerly picked up on the concept of takfir. Based on it, he wrote extensively about the religious justification of harming and killing other Muslims, because his final goal wasn't theological theory, but penal practice, which he got to in the end. His name was Osama bin Laden. Which finally brings us back to our heroes, who are about to ring in the third act. Luckily enough for their leaders, upon arrival at Constantinople, they already had a brilliant scheme on hand when it came to convincing their surprised underlings of the necessity to attack yet another Christian city, the biggest one to boot. Not only did they repeat the heartwarming story about the young prince who wanted nothing more than for his disenfranchised family to be able to serve a loving and supportive people, they also didn't forget to mention the literally unbelievable reward they had to expect. And just in case anyone didn't quite get the point, or the seriousness of the situation, or just the pureness of their hearts, the noble boardroom literally threw themselves onto the ground and, crying their eyes out, they begged their soldiers to stick around. Who says collective deception and emotional blackmail don't go together? Well, at least some of the Crusaders might have gotten a little suspicious when they paraded Prince Alexios up and down the city walls on a ship, and none of the people on those walls seemed to react to that in any way. To be fair though, one reason for that might have been the utter surprise of seeing a large fleet show up to their city. The last time that had happened was centuries ago, and whoever had tried that in the past had soon found out. Like, for instance, the Arabs, whom the Byzantines had introduced to their hot new invention named Greek fire. So, with that historical precedent in mind, Even the fact that their own navy had shrunk down to a measly 20 ships didn't let the people of Constantinople lose any sleep. Because, let's be honest, nobody's crazy enough to show up here with a fleet, right? Because, come to think of it, that would also be dangerous, seeing as the impregnable Theodosian walls only protect the land side of Constantinople, whereas the walls facing the body of water named the Golden Horn are about as flimsy as the Byzantine army, which inside the city clock in at about 8,000 soldiers. Of course, the about 300,000 inhabitants could, in theory, help defend their hometown. Then again, with the current emperor being a usurper, an armed citizenry could easily become a double-edged sword in a Roman minute. After all, coming to the throne via regicide only leaves one target for the next go-around. And so, with this whole scenario amounting to a powder keg of historic proportions, all that was missing were two matches, one that misfired and one that did the job. The first one was struck when negotiations about the Crusaders' plan to put young Alexius on the throne were predictably rebuffed. And on July 5th, 1203, the Crusader fleet successfully captured the Golden Horn and sailed up to the sea walls. A few days later, they started their assault, and with archer platforms tied to the tops of their masts, they were able to shoot down on the defenders and eventually breach the ramparts. The emperor fled the city, Alexius was installed on the throne, and if that had been the end of the story, this chapter would have amounted to little more than another Byzantine civil war. But of course, it wasn't, because the promises the kid had made turned out to be about as solid as his claim to the throne, starting with the money, which he simply didn't have. And when he not only sent out a slew of tax collectors to come up with the cash, but also started melting down church ornaments for precious metals, the mood in the city began to shift. More and more, the Crusaders were seen as the invaders and occupiers they actually were, and the kid that had brought them to Constantinople to begin with as the puppet he actually was. Which brings us to the second match, the one that worked. When locals started attacking not just Crusaders but also Latin inhabitants from Western Europe, the Crusaders retaliated by looting pretty much anybody, including the businesses of Muslim traders. When their Byzantine colleagues came to their defense, the Crusaders set multiple houses on fire. The winds coming from the Bosporus did the rest, and 3 days later about 1/6 of the city had been burned to the ground, leaving around 100,000 people homeless. Somewhat predictably, the puppet emperor was deposed by his own people. His replacement gave the Crusaders 1 week to leave, which was, of course, hilarious given the situation. What followed instead was the first ever sack of Constantinople, which, at this point, was 900 years old. About 2,000 inhabitants were killed, and everything from houses to statues to churches to monasteries to tombs of former emperors was plundered. Rough estimates put the value stolen from the city at about 1 million silver marks. All of that was the human and material damage. What gets discussed much less often is the political fallout. One of the leaders of the crusade, Baldwin of Flanders, was crowned Emperor of Constantinople, and the Byzantine territory replaced by the Latin, meaning Western Empire. Rather unbelievably, there were actual Crusader states in Christian Europe. It was only the fact that the Crusader forces were simply too small to cover all of the Eastern Roman Empire that the Byzantine aristocracy was able to establish a small number of rump states, for instance in Nicaea. It took the Eastern Romans until 1261 to regain control of Constantinople and put the Byzantine Empire back on track. Needless to say, at that point, the party was over. The days of olden glory were long gone, and the Greek part of the Roman Empire never even came close to reaching any of its past heights concerning territory, military, or economy. Oh, and needless to say, when Innocent III heard of this epic disaster, he fully understood that the schism between the Roman and Greek churches was now solidified beyond repair. And indeed, it took almost 1,300 years for a pope to even set foot on Greek soil, let alone bring up the issue of the Fourth Crusade. Meaning, when Innocent was finally down to DEFCON 4 again, he took a deep breath, then he took a pen, and excommunicated the Crusaders again. So, when the history books try to tell you that Constantinople didn't fall until 1453, you know that's not true. It fell in 1204 to a zombie crusade. Quick and pace. Thanks for watching.